All right, so today we're going to dive into express trusts. Not just the basics, but really why they might be something you should consider when it comes to commerce. We're working with WEISS'S Concise Trustee Handbook for this deep dive, and it's already got me thinking that maybe express trusts are a bit of a secret weapon.
Yeah, it's interesting. What makes them so fascinating is that they're rooted in common law and equity. So unlike a corporation, which is formed under government statutes, express trusts, they kind of operate with a different set of rules.
A different set of rules, like a parallel system almost. Now, our listeners are no strangers to the ins and outs of asset management, so think of this deep dive as like unlocking a new level of that.
Exactly. And Weiss, he talks about this thing called the control test. It's not just legal jargon, it's really the heart of why express trust can be so powerful.
Okay, so control test. Break that down for me a little bit. What is that?
Basically, for a trust to be a real express trust, control over the assets, they can't be with the beneficiaries, right? They have to be solely with the trustee.
So, like a clear separation between the one managing the assets and the ones benefiting from them.
Mm.
Is that something that's different from, say, a corporation?
Yeah, definitely. With a corporation, you have shareholders, you have directors. It's a little more, I guess you could say
It's
diffused.
shared control, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this separation is really where things get interesting with express trust, especially when you start thinking about things like asset protection.
Okay, let's talk about that. I mean, everybody wants to protect what they've built. So what makes express trusts different in that regard?
Well, because the trustee is the sole decision maker, and they're acting based on that trust agreement. It can really create this kind of shield around the assets.
A shield.
Like if you structure it right, following what Weiss says, it's almost like you're building this fortress around your assets that you just wouldn't be able to do with a regular business.
So it's like creating a legal entity that's just harder to penetrate, harder to get at. Now, the handbook mentions jurisdiction a few times, and I
Yeah.
gotta say, that word always throws me a little.
Well, it's actually super important, and it makes sense once you wrap your head around it. Basically, there are two types of jurisdiction to think about: subject matter and personal. Subject matter is all about whether a court actually has the authority to even hear a case. Like, do they have the power to make decisions about this type of issue?
Okay, so that's the what of the legal situation.
Yeah.
And then personal jurisdiction is about the who.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's about whether the court can actually exercise power over the specific people or the entities involved in the case.
Gotcha. So how does all of this play into express trusts?
Well, because express trusts come from that common law tradition, they often fall outside the normal jurisdiction of courts that are set up for statutory law.
Meaning?
Think of it like this. They're operating in a different legal sphere.
A different legal sphere.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really cool, because it opens the door to a whole new level of potential legal autonomy.
Wait, hold on. Are we saying that express trusts, just by their very nature, might be able to avoid certain legal battles that a corporation or an individual would normally face?
That's exactly what Weiss is getting at. It's understanding that an express trust, if it's structured properly, it might be able to do things legally that other structures just can't.
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. It's like we've got this whole new set of rules that we can potentially use to our advantage. So how do we actually tap into this? How does an express trust actually work in the real world? So how does an express trust actually work, like day to day? We've talked about the trustee's control, but what about actually doing business, managing those assets?
That's where the details get really important. And Weiss, he's all about the details. He talks about this thing called the due notice rule, which basically means you got to be upfront about the trust being involved in any transactions.
Okay, so no, like, trying to hide it or be sneaky about it.
Exactly. You got to be transparent.
Why is that so important?
Well, it goes back to that separation we talked about, right? By being clear that you're acting as the trustee, it's like you're reinforcing that line between your actions and the trust's actions, keeping that protection up.
So it's like this legal shield that only works if you don't try to hide it.
Exactly. And this transparency, it goes for contracts too. Vice actually recommends using really specific language in those contracts to limit liability. It's not just about saying, oh, hey, this is a trust. It's about spelling out exactly where that liability falls and, more importantly, where it doesn't.
That's got to be an important detail because it's one thing to say like, oh, I'm protected, but it's another to have it in writing in every agreement you make.
Absolutely. And he even gives this example of saying straight up, neither the trustee nor the beneficiaries are personally on the hook for the trust's debts. really driving that separation home.
Yeah, making it crystal clear.
Exactly.
So it seems like there's a lot of legal specifics with express trusts,
Okay.
but isn't that kind of the point? It's like creating this system that has its own set of rules.
Exactly. It's like building a house. You need that solid foundation. And speaking of structure, the handbook dives into certificates and bonds, which might seem kind of, I don't know, out of left field, but it all ties back into this idea of operating within this unique framework.
Okay, I'll be honest. When I first saw certificates and bonds, I was like, uh-oh, here we go. Can you break that down for me, make it make sense?
Sure, think about it like this. Just like a corporation can issue stock and express trust, it can divide up its assets into shares, and those are represented by certificates.
So it's like having a piece of the pie, but the pie is protected inside this trust structure.
Exactly. But here's a key difference. Those certificate holders, they don't have the same kind of control as shareholders in a corporation, right? That control, it stays with the trustee.
So even with the certificates, the trustee is still calling the shots.
Exactly. They're managing everything according to the trust agreement.
Okay, so what about bonds? How do those fit in?
Think of bonds like a way for the trust to raise some capital, kind of like issuing its own IOUs, promising to pay back with interest down the line.
So it's like having its own little financial system separate from regular banks and stuff.
That's a great way to put it. And Weiss, he really stresses the importance of documenting everything. The certificates, the bonds, all the transactions. We're talking minutes, accounting, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, I could see why it's got to be important to show that everything's being done above board, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It proves that the trust is doing what it's supposed to, keeping those personal and trust dealings separate, which is crucial if anyone ever questions the trust's legitimacy.
So it's not just about knowing the rules, it's about showing that you've been following them all along.
Exactly. And this takes us back to jurisdiction because since express trusts often fall outside those courts focused on statutory law, the way they're managed, the way they're documented, it becomes even more important.
It's like we've established this express trust is sailing under a different flag, so we better make sure its logbook is spotless.
You got it. That's a great analogy. And if legal issues do come up, one of the first things an express trust can do is challenge the court's jurisdiction. Remember, if they don't have the authority, subject matter, or personal, they can't hear the case.
It's about using that unique legal space that express trusts have to their advantage.
Absolutely. And Weiss, he's a big advocate for something he calls the commercial process, whenever possible.
Okay, commercial process. What is that exactly?
It's basically about private negotiation and dispute resolution, like finding solutions outside of the traditional court system.
So more like diplomacy than all-out war.
Yeah, exactly. It's often faster, cheaper, and way more private. Plus, even if you don't reach an agreement, just going through that process shows good faith, and it can actually make your position stronger if you do end up in court.
It's like saying, hey, we tried to work this out ourselves, but now we're ready to defend our position.
Exactly. And remember, we're talking about assets, commerce, potentially a lot of value here. Weiss points out that express trusts might offer a different way of looking at taxes, too.
Okay, taxes, everyone's favorite topic. But seriously, how do express trusts change things on that front?
The specifics can get complicated, but the key takeaway is this. If you structure it right, an express trust might be able to give you tax advantages you wouldn't have otherwise.
Like what kind of advantages are we talking about?
Potentially lower tax rates on the income the trust generates, maybe even sheltering some assets from certain taxes.
Legally navigating around those tax burdens, I like it.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, transparency and compliance are key here. The IRS, they're not messing around with what they consider abusive trusts.
Right, so it's about understanding the rules of the game, playing strategically, not trying to cheat the system.
Exactly. Now, we've talked a lot about the good stuff, but it's important to remember express trusts aren't without risk. If they're not set up right, if they're not managed properly, they can be challenged. They can even fall apart.
So it's like having this powerful tool at your disposal,
Yeah,
but you need to know how to use it.
that's a great way to put it. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It requires careful planning, expert advice, and really understanding the legal landscape before you dive in.
Speaking of diving in, Weiss gets into the nuts and bolts of administering an express trust, like opening bank accounts, handling transactions. I'm guessing it's all about maintaining that separation right.
You got it.
Yeah.
When you open a bank account, it needs to be in the trust's name, not your name personally. You're presenting the trust as its own separate entity.
So it's like showing the bank the trust's passport, proving it's the real deal.
Exactly. And Weiss also recommends getting a separate EIN for the trust, its own tax ID number. That further solidifies its independent existence.
Okay, so we've got the bank account, the EIN. What about day-to-day transactions like buying and selling assets?
That's where the trustee's fiduciary duty comes in. Every action they take, every decision they make, it has to be in the best interest of the beneficiaries, and it has to follow the rules laid out in the trust agreement.
No funny business.
Exactly. No funny business.
Now, Weiss also mentions precious metals, which seems interesting. What's the deal with that?
Well, under common law, precious metals, especially gold and silver, they're seen as portable land, like a physical representation of wealth.
Portable land. I like that.
Yeah, and Weiss suggests that Express Trust, they can be a really good fit for holding and managing these kinds of assets.
So it's like having a treasure chest filled with stuff that has real value and operates under a different set of rules.
You got it. He even suggests getting specific types of gold coins, the ones that have a history of being exempt from U.S. confiscation laws, and holding some silver, too, for potential bartering and trading.
It's like diversifying the treasure chest, understanding the history and the nuances of these assets.
Exactly. And here's a crucial point. When it comes to those precious metals, take possession of them. Don't leave them with some third-party custodian.
Keep that treasure chest close, under your control, within the trust's protection.
You got it. This might all seem pretty complex, but that's the trade-off for having more autonomy and control, you know? It takes a bit more knowledge, a bit more engagement.
Yeah. It's like we're not just sailing anymore. We're navigating, using charts and compasses, understanding the currents to really chart our own course.
That's a great way to put it. Express trusts, they're not for the passive observer. They're for people who want to take the helm and steer their own financial and legal ship, so to speak.
It's been fascinating to really dive into this with you, going from the basics to the ins and outs of jurisdiction, transactions, even precious metals.
Yeah, and it all comes back to that idea that express trusts, they operate in a different legal world, and understanding that world, understanding how to navigate it, it might give you some unique advantages in today's world.
It's like we've found this hidden network operating under the surface of all the usual business and legal stuff.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Weiss seems to be saying that express trusts aren't just a different tool, they're a whole different way of thinking about ownership, control, even commerce itself.
And a big part of that seems to be this commercial process we keep talking about. It's like this alternative system for handling disputes, making agreements, all outside the usual channels.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, shaping the legal environment you operate in, not just reacting to it. Weiss argues that this commercial process, it comes from common law and the law merchant, and it can be way more efficient, less expensive, and definitely more private than going through the courts.
So less about court battles, more about negotiating treaties, kind of.
Precisely. And while it doesn't completely replace the traditional legal system, it does give you a way to maybe sidestep some of the headaches and limitations, especially if you're working within an express trust.
Choosing the battlefield that works best for you. Now, you mentioned the law merchant, which sounds like something out of a history book. What's its relevance today?
It's actually really interesting. It goes back centuries to merchants doing business internationally, needing a system that worked for them. So it was all about customs, good faith, resolving disputes quickly and fairly. And you know what? A lot of those principles, they still hold up today, especially in global commerce. It shows you how some legal ideas, especially those that prioritize individual freedom and direct agreement, they have staying power.
Like those old trade rights that are still relevant today. Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive. The technical parts of express trusts, the benefits, asset protection, even taxes.
And let's not forget that crucial separation between trustee and beneficiaries, the importance of meticulous record keeping, the whole jurisdictional aspect.
It's a lot to take in, but I think the main takeaway is this. Express trusts, they're not a magic solution, and they're not for everyone.
They require a certain approach. You have to be proactive, detail-oriented, maybe even a little adventurous.
It's like the difference between being a passenger on a cruise ship and being the captain of your own ship.
Exactly. Both will get you where you're going, but the experience, the level of control, it's completely different.
And as with any journey, the key is to choose the right vessel, plan your route, and keep learning about the waters you're sailing in.
Well said.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into express trusts, to say the least. Hopefully it's sparked some curiosity, maybe even inspired some of you to learn more.
Remember, knowledge is power, especially in today's world, when it comes to commerce, asset management, all of that.
So until next time, Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
It's unbelievable, it's unbelievable, it's unbelievable. Yo, the word magic, they used to fool the people and it's tragic. They don't teach this in the schools, word magic. They used to fool the people and it's tragic. It's time to be wise. Demystification of their classy set of rules.